We're live.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Let's call the meeting to order. We are still waiting for another person or two to join us, but we do have a quorum, so we can get started. First of all, is there any public testimony?
There's none.
Okay, good, thank you. Now let's move on to the minutes of the meeting of July 28th. Are there any corrections or additions? I think I saw a typo that I fixed in my version. This is on the second page, down in the discussion on hiring tax review commission. The line that starts, Chair Giesting asked how Dr. Caracavalli's consulting fees would be paid, and consulting needed to be corrected. But otherwise, I have no additions or corrections. If nobody else does, can I have a motion to approve?
Move to approve with that correction.
Thank you, Alton. Second? I'm sorry, who seconded? Sale? All right. Yep. All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, well, I am so glad to welcome our guests here today, led by Dr. Jack Kinger, talking about the visitor green fee. So I think I can let you take it away, Jack.
Thank you, and we appreciate the invitation. And with me is Eric Coe with the Harold Castle Foundation, and Carissa Cabrera, who works with us on communications. And we represent a larger consortium of partners that have been really key to this. A number of folks from the visitor sector, from the environmental conservation organizations around Hawaii, and many other folks. So what we thought we'd do, Beth, and we've chatted a bit about this over email, is just give a short overview of the Green Fee Initiative. We've been working on this for about 4 years collectively, or at least intensively. This is an idea that's been around for far longer than that, as many of you probably know. And then we would just open it up for discussion. Does that sound good to you?
Yes, please.
Great. Well, I am going to attempt to share my screen with all of you. So if I do this and do a slideshow, can you guys see the slideshow?
Not yet. We can see your screen, but it's not in.
Let's see here. How about this? How does that look?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Great. And can you see my notes? It's fine if you can. Just
no, we can't see your notes, but we can see the full screen.
Well, then I've passed the first test of getting this slideshow to show accurately. So, so thank you all. We'll just jump in, and then we'll jump into a discussion, which I know Carissa and Eric and I will all be excited to have. So just as a quick sale plan for this very brief overview, we're going to start first on, what the problem that this would solve is, and then explore green fees as one solution that applies to the issues that we face as an archipelago. Great. Okay, so the motivation for this, for us, from the outset, is that there is a major gap between the value that nature provides to our economy in our communities and what we invest in it. And there's different ways to calculate that value in economic terms. Ecological economic analyses have indicated that our forests are worth around $2 billion, that our reefs provide about $700 million per year. We know we have something like 100,000 ocean-based jobs, generating a large amount of wages to our communities. And, there's other ways to sort of value that nature. I mean, there's some values that are incalculable. I can't say that right, but the cultural values that these environments provide to our communities. And then we can also be very discreet in sort of estimating the food security benefits, the environmental quality benefits, the economic benefits that these provide. So with that value, we invest very little, unfortunately, to protect and manage it. And by extension, to manage and ensure the economic benefits from these resources. This is a common statistic that we use, that about 1% of the state budget is allocated to the Department of Land and Natural Resources. This varies, depending on how we calculate it and year over year, depending on what is invested in. But what we did is we took the entire level of investment from the federal, state, and from private sources in natural resource management. And we calculated that, and it came out to about 500 million. And then we looked at, on a first principles basis, what would we need to manage the ecosystems and the natural resources that we have in a way that best protects the infrastructure and value that they return to our communities. And that's about, it's close to about 900 million. So we have a big gap here. We have about a 40% funding gap. So this was our motivating factor. We did this analysis quite a long time ago. It could be updated and it could surely be sharpened. We've talked with UHERO about sharpening it. We believe it's directionally accurate, even if it's not precisely perfect. But it is a big gap. And even if we had yes.
Just wanted to know, how do you estimate the conservation funding need?
Oh, the one on the right side, the 900 million?
Yes.
We looked at equivalent figures from other geographies, and some economists have worked on this. It is not an area of practice in ecological economics that has a deep methodological foundation. So we did talk with UHERO 3 or 4 years ago about how we would update this. So I don't want to say it's back of the envelope, but it's not methodologically a deep investment in calculating that.
Thank you.
I will note, though, that this the Climate Commission has looked at this in more depth with respect to infrastructure and climate readiness, and their numbers are much bigger. This does not include that. This is primarily focused on ecosystems and natural resources, not human infrastructure. So yeah, we could get a little bit more precise with that. But either way, the gap is significant. So we're looking at how do we close this gap and finance essentially the targets that we've set for ourselves in the Aloha Plus Challenge. Eric and I were there, and maybe some of you were too, when we hosted the World Conservation Conference in 2016. For those of you not familiar with this event, this is like hosting the Olympics for conservation. The whole world came to our islands, and they came because then President Barack Obama agreed to host it and pushed for that, and so did local stakeholders. And it was a tremendous event, and Governor Ige rolled out the Aloha Plus targets there around our environmental sustainability challenge. And he committed Hawaii along with, Hawaii to this 30 by 30 challenge. And that's to protect and manage our lands and waters, 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. And that is a global target that is well accepted and will probably be adopted by the Convention on Biological Diversity in Kunming, China, early next year. A global target setting process that will so Hawaii was ahead of the curve in committing itself to 30 by 30. We have to finance our way towards that. Now, financing that is, of course, a huge interest to our conservation sector, but it also needs to be a big interest of our visitor sector because we underinvest compared to our competitors when it comes to per capita spending on natural resources for visitors. You look at how many arrivals we have and how much money goes into natural resource management. Take a look at what Australia does, or Galapagos, or Palau in terms of per visitor spending, and we're dismally low. We are extremely low. The first time we calculated this out, we had a dinner, and I invited 9 folks to come to that dinner, and I told them to bring $1 each. And they brought $1, and we said, this is what we spend for our visitors in terms of the natural resources that nearly all our visitors come to see. And the statistics on that are very clear. So when we started this initiative, we had the highest numbers of visitors and 10.2 million. And then, of course, we experienced the lowest number of visitors that we've seen in decades associated with the pandemic. And the economic impact of that has been massive. And I'm sure you guys are all grappling with that, as are we. We had, I think we still have the highest unemployment in the country. And this has sparked a long discussion about how do we green and diversify our economy. And that is something that's never been more of an imperative than it is today, as we see how vulnerable that we have been with the collapse of tourism. So those are big problems: financing our conservation gap and greening and diversifying our economy and creating jobs in an innovation cluster in our sector. That is the environmental sector. And this is one solution. It certainly is not the only solution. It's just one that we have been working on for 4 years because we see how transformative it can be. And my organization, Conservation International, has worked on this in many other places. We work in 40 countries. We have staff all throughout the developing world and the tropics primarily, and we've implemented these systems. So we have some in-house expertise, which was part of how we launched into this. It's also an old idea in Hawaii. One of the best examples that we've drawn from is Palau. And Palau has, I think it's fair to say, probably one of the world leading systems with respect to a visitor green fee. If you fly to Palau, you pay $100 for what they call their pristine paradise fee. I actually sit as Conservation International's representative on the Palau Protected Area Network Fund. This is the fund that the fees go into. And that public-private board then decides how to allocate the visitor green fee funding to support conservation in Palau. And it supports dozens and dozens of jobs in Palau. And it's coupled with a pledge. And if you've ever gone to Palau, you'll know that when you fly into Palau, they stamp your passport with this pledge. This is your entry visa. So you read it and sign it right there at Customs and Immigration when you enter the country. And they have a lovely video to socialize the pledge. So the pledge and the fee go hand in hand as ways to finance conservation and then educate visitors and help them feel like they're part of the program. Now, we've looked at a bunch of different options, drawing from an analysis of 12 different green fee systems across the world. And we've looked at national systems like Palau, and we've looked at subnational systems like the Galapagos. All of these systems, of course, have different legal and policy regimes than does Hawaii, but those systems do give us some insights in which options essentially are on the menu for us. And to boil it down and make it really simple, our two main options are to establish a new visitor green fee system or to use an existing system and have a carve out or somehow green that funding stream. We've looked at both, and we were lucky to have a pro bono legal analysis done for us by a well-respected law firm that looked at the legal barriers and pathways that exist for these different options. We can get into that if that's of interest. And then, of course, many of these options have been the subject for different legislation that's been introduced in the last two sessions, and which we expect will be introduced in the session to come. Now, to put a couple scenarios on here, when we first designed this, before we had done the legal analysis, we had this idea of what we called our 10-50-500. And these are just scenarios. You folks are way smarter and way sharper on the different sort of tax pathways that can be shaped for a solution such as this. But in the beginning, we thought, well, if we really wanted to close that gap, and we have 10 million visitors, if we somehow come up with a $50 per head fee, we'll generate 500 million. Then looking at the different pathways that we are, presented with, by far the most relevant and existing pathways, of course, the TAT. And there were several bills in the last session that proposed different modifications to that. I know Seth Colby's on the call, and Seth had done some modeling on some of those scenarios. Seth, this might not be perfectly right, so I'm sure you'll correct me if it's wrong, but we looked at like a 1%. What would 1% of the TAT, if we just added 1% to the TAT and used that for our green fund, what would that generate? And Seth had modeled out that, it would start around 140 in FY22 and increase to about 220 million per year by 2027, I believe. But of course, the landscape has changed with respect to the TAT, given what the legislature passed last year. But that's, there's different options other than these two. We've looked at one bill had just a per head charge that would require new tax policy and potentially new structures. The TAT is there. We looked at rental car fees, and then we have also looked at things that don't exist, such as a natural resources permit of some kind, which is technically legally possible, but very complicated. So these are things we're still exploring, and obviously we're trying to think mostly about feasibility for these different options. So just to wrap up here, the impact of this, one of the things that we looked at when the pandemic really unfolded and when the first stimulus was coming down the pipe, we quickly organized the conservation sector and said, how many jobs could we support if we had stimulus funding, significant stimulus funding? And we polled all the organizations across all the counties and all the communities, and we could overnight create 4,000 jobs in the green sector, the conservation and natural resource sector. We've talked with you here and other folks looking at sort of innovation clusters in the Hawaii economy and diversification. It seems very clear to us that this sort of creation, this job creation potential is significant. And this is a way to put people back to work. And there's the best proof of this, I think, is the program that Kupu launched with stimulus funds that was small. It was about $5 or $6 million, and I think it was about 400 jobs. They had 4x the number of applications than they had spots, and the jobs were advertised for 2 weeks. Eric and I sit on the advisory board for that initiative. It was tremendously transformative. The impact of it economically was positive, and the job retention was great. So we know we can create jobs in this sector. We know there's demand. At the same time, creating that job workforce will actually help us reach our 30 by 30 challenge. We've set these targets. To be quite frank, we have not made a lot of progress towards them since we set them very publicly in 2016 in front of the world. We continue to face challenges both with homegrown threats, pollution, development, over-harvesting invasive species, and increasing with global threats, particularly climate change, which is having huge impacts on everything from our rainfall to our coral reefs to our forests. So we've got to get out ahead of this because this is a shared threat for all of our industries. So Patagonia is sort of known for saying there's no business on a dead planet, but there's no visitor sector on a depleted Hawaiian Island archipelago. So we've found a lot of common cause with the visitor sector on that issue, particularly the folks that are locally based and care deeply about their communities. And we think this is we have a lot of evidence that the conservation and visitor sectors see eye to eye on these issues, and we're just trying to figure out what the mechanisms are for these options. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'm sure I missed a lot. Sure there'll be questions, and Eric and Chris and I are excited for the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. Who has a question? Who wants to be first? Well, while you're thinking about it, I have a couple of questions. The first one is pretty basic. What is the 30 by 30 challenge that was set in 2016?
Yeah, Eric, do you want to take this one?
Sure, there are actually two parallel ones. Both of them are aimed to protect 30% of our natural resource space by 2030. There's a terrestrial one as far as particularly native forests and largely intact native forests. And then the other is a nearshore ocean goal. So to effectively manage 30% of our nearshore waters by 2030.
Okay, thank you.
And this is our what are called the Aloha Plus challenges. I know Murray will know this very well. And they are 6 targets that were set and endorsed by the executive branch, the legislature, and a consortium of CEOs, including OHA. They've been around since the Abercrombie administration, and we've sharpened the environmental and natural resources target into this 30 by 30, which is more discrete than it was originally written.
Some more questions.
Yeah, I have a question still. This is not, I mean, I know the presentation was on a funding source, but what in kind of the conceptual model, what happens to the money? Is it administered by the state, or is it passed out in grants, or how does it translate between a fee collected by the government into something that affects people?
This is a common question, and thank you for asking it. Well, there are different ways to do this, right? And typically in other geographies, the model that we found that has been the most acceptable and effective in our estimation is a public-private management model. And an example of that locally is the Waikiki Beach Improvement District, where public funds go into a special fund that then is overseen by a board that has public and private leadership as part of it. And they together then direct how the funds will be used for things that will obviously benefit the private sector and benefit the area. So that's what we proposed, or at least several bills had proposed this in last session, to have a public-private management approach to this. But of course, there's this whole discussion about special funds too. That's part of the whole political debate right now. So that's sort of wrapped up in that.
Thanks.
The bills would create, most of the bills propose creating a special fund, essentially, that would aggregate this, and then it would be could be drawn on for projects that would benefit, help us reach the 30 by 30.
We talked about this, I think, Jack, a few years ago when you and members of your team presented the green fee concept to us here at Lupono. And my concern remains that the legislature has a long and, I might suggest, shameful, but that's probably too judgmental, history of rating special funds for use in the general fund. And I would guarantee almost that if there was 500 million or 300 million of extra funding available, they would be highly tempted and most likely would try to raid that. So there'd have to be significant thought given as to how to protect the fund to make sure that it would be used for the purpose for which it was intended and not become a bait and switch.
That's it's just part of the landscape, right, for this. And so Eric and I have talked a lot about this over the years, and there are some ways to encumber special funds, right? If you mix federal money with it, you sort of encumber it in certain ways. So there's also just, I mean, honestly, a lot of these green funds that exist in other countries are managed outside of the home domain. Like our green fee fund for Raja Ampat in Indonesia is managed out of Singapore. So we legislated in. I mean, that's not something we would do here locally, but it's an attempt to address essentially the same thing. There's no bulletproof strategy for this, but there are ways to make it harder. And I'll welcome Eric to jump into this too. The last thing I'll just say is that if this thing supports a constituency, particularly direct jobs in the economy, my expectation is it would make it harder, but nothing is bulletproof.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I think, Marita, that's a really fair question. And frankly, if we get to that bridge to cross, I think we'll be in a pretty good position. I think I agree with Jack. There are ways that are less legal and maybe more ethical to try and protect them. We've talked about, you can encumber with federal funds. You could encumber with private funds too. Another idea would be to have a youth board, right? Part of this philosophically is to create an opportunity for, our children and generations to follow, to kind of find their own solutions to problems we don't even see yet. And so if there was a youth membership or a youth aspect to it, I would hope it would be a little bit more difficult to raid. I think justifying the application of the funds, green workforce development, I think more generally just the idea that local residents should have an opportunity through their career pathways and through their jobs to help define what an authentic visitor experience should be directly, rather than go through some kind of centralized marketing campaign. And so if we're supporting a lot of the organizations, Murray, that you and I support, and forgive me for those folks who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, I work for the Harold Castle Foundation. So if this fund were to create jobs of that ilk, then I think it would be a little bit more difficult for them to raid. Of course, there's also the issue of spending ceilings for special funds as well. So, I mean, there's a lot to work around, and it's a completely justified concern.
You know, Murray and everybody, sometimes when I think of what spending, I think of first principles, which is incentives, right? And really what you're worried, you want some kind of accountability for this spending. And really special funds, a lot of people are critical of them because there's a lot of money that just sits in special funds because there's low levels of accountability in terms of spending that money correctly and wisely. And anybody who's worked in government knows that like June is the time when you spend all your money, or the last month of the fiscal year, because you don't want to give it away. And half of that money is not spent correctly. So, you know, I think the public-private partnership is a good idea. I also it'd be interesting if you could figure out some kind of incentive structure where the private sector is actually putting money into the deal and wanting money back, right? So there is some kind of value being produced. Now we're talking about natural resources, so we could use some kind of, you know, a little bit more elaborate mechanism to think about the public goods being provided by these resources. But anytime you start to put like values in markets, it really focuses people's minds on things. And then the other thing with like just the job is, yes, it's always good to create a constituency for your spending. On the other hand, constituencies don't always have their own, you know, they have their own incentive structure too, right? So people just want jobs. They don't want to make it, you know, what we're trying to do is actually improve the environment. So the other thing to think about when you're doing all this is, you know, are you just creating, is this just a jobs program? In which case it's hard to get rid of jobs programs, as Jack has pointed out. But what you really want to do is you want to create a really effective jobs program that conserves the environment and creates value and jobs. And, you know, like I've sat with other people and sat down and they're like, oh, if you just give us money, we'll create this many jobs, this many public funds. And I always encourage people to think about like, how can you make these jobs at least partially self-sustaining? Because that means they're providing value and people are willing to pay for value, right? And so the whole idea of this fee system is people perceive value in the natural resources and they want to experience it and they're willing to pay for that, right? So I would encourage people to think about on the other side of the fence is like, how are you ensuring that you're getting value from the money spent?
Great point, Seth. We've had so many questions about the sorts of ways the money could be spent. And, you know, there's, I think to Eric's point, if we're at that stage, we're probably at a pretty good stage for this because we've figured out how we might collect funding and generate revenue. But we've always sort of envisioned this as a mechanism that would go and help support private, nonprofit, and public sector jobs. And early on, we were talking with the Oahu Visitors Bureau, and they had amalgamated all the spending that private sector tourism businesses were putting into the environment. And it was substantial. So you can imagine this could be a matching mechanism to entice the private sector to, you know, top up or match their existing investments. And that would be a way to, you know, have jobs have shared revenue streams, some from the private sector and some from this fund. So there's a whole different set of scenarios that we've put together on that, you know, at least in a perspective way to think through the design of the policy to address some of the issues that you brought up. But we've got to land on a most feasible and most palatable design model that can be adopted. And that's a very dynamic landscape right now, particularly given the changes to special funds and TAT and other things.
Can you discuss more about your experience working with the legislature, where things are right now, and what you're hoping to accomplish in the next session? Because I'm concerned about the timeline for 30 by 30. We have to make some progress, obviously.
Yeah, and usually when I present this, I put this ticking clock up there first. Murray's probably seen this, but the IPCC reports have come out, and the last one was even more disturbing. And we have 10 years to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. And we just have not moved the ball really down the field a heck of a lot since 2016. It's 5 years past that. So on the ledge, the first bills for this, we've had 2 years of bills in this. And of course, the first year was right when the pandemic hit. So the whole ledge, as you guys recall, shut down. And last year we had 6 bills, I believe, 3 in the Senate, 3 in the House. Seth will remember this because I think some of them required Seth to do some modeling on what those bills would do from a tax perspective and revenue perspective. We had a bill make it from both the Senate and the House into crossover, but then didn't get hearings. These are, because of the nature of this, we're getting these triple and quadruple referrals. So we have, I think it's fair to say, a pretty good leadership from the finance chairs of the House and the Senate, interest in this, that is to say. And we certainly have some members on both sides that are keenly interested in this and are introducing bills. We just presented to the Environmental Caucus recently, chaired by Nicole Lowen and Mike Gabbard. And, there will be bills in the next session. And most of the bills have been based on our analysis that we completed in 2018, I believe, and are directionally sharpening. And one of the strategies that we're trying to, there's sort of 2 strategic fronts that we're on. The first is the internal strategy. How do we advise, work with legislators who are interested in this policy solution? And perhaps how do we align a critical mass of leadership around 1 or 2 bills rather than a diversity of different ones? The second strategy is to build an external constituency for this. You guys, I'm sure, have seen what we've seen with respect to community sentiment around tourism. In my view, it seems like it's at an all-time high in terms of negativity. The visitor sector is certainly aware of that. HTA, with whom we have a great relationship and have talked quite a bit with, is working on that. I think, I'm not exactly sure how John DeFries put it, but he said something along the lines like, we cannot campaign our way out of this. We have to offer real solutions. And that was a really keen insight, and he's very committed to that. And so Carissa, working with us, is helping build an external campaign around the idea of a green fee as a solution and a pledge. Both those things add up to, this sort of timeline where we're looking at the end of the year, right? The ledge session is going to start. We're having lots of discussions with legislators now about that. But the big thing we haven't solved for the potential bills is the mechanism and what is feasible given what we talked about earlier with special funds, spending ceilings, and TAT. And Seth's smiling because he probably knows more about the dynamics of that than I do, but we have got to settle on a mechanism that has the most chance of getting through the gauntlet of the legislature. So, Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Just maybe to answer your question a little bit more directly about as to where the ledge was or what the perspectives within the legislature was last session. Definitely there was a sense of this is not focused. There are too many bills. Another was this kind of tension between, is this a way to disincentivize visitors to Hawaii in large numbers or incentivize the right visitor to Hawaii? as Seth was talking about earlier, and that's something that we had to kind of navigate quite a bit. There are others who, touching the TAT, everyone was eyeing TAT, obviously. Touching the TAT was a bit of a deal breaker to some because, obviously the hospitality industry still harbors a lot of resentment about the way that was, what happened after that was established and its consequent use, which, has, in their eyes, gotten worse. So that mechanism is a little tricky to navigate too. There are other legislators that feel like we are kind of rather than that we're doing well in taking steps toward kind of a decentralized means of collecting a green fee rather than a centralized one. You folks probably know well that state parks has been kind of methodically creating a reservation system around their state parks, Wainapa Napa and Diamond Head. They're a little concerned about instituting a statewide framework right away because they want to be sensitive to the various needs and dynamics of each of their parks. And then of course, there's also the county park system as well. What that means for, so that's maybe one way to get around this concern of, the Commerce Clause and, the free movement between states as part of the US nation. On the mechanism end, that's one potential way to do that is kind of create a network of reservation systems that have fees associated with them. But then we're still to the special fund kind of conundrum in terms of, okay, well, how is this, where is this banked and how is it spent? I do agree with, just to go back to an earlier bit of the conversation, I do agree with this idea of not only encumbering the funds with private or federal funds, most likely private, but also making the funds work, maybe through green bonding or such, where it's kind of spoken for, and that way maybe locked in as well. But those were some of the things that we learned from this past session that we're trying to consider as we move into this next session. I at this point, I don't think we can say that there's a clear kind of approach that's come into focus yet. Jack, keep me honest on that, but still figuring it out.
So just to the council or the commissioners, what happened last session with TAT
Yeah, we can hear you.
A little here we go. Last session, TAT happened, something that it was very chaotic legislative process with the TAT. And basically there was there's been a lot of contention about what the county should get versus what the states should get. And they passed this legislation that allowed, basically took all of the county funds away from the TAT, but allowed them to impose their own TAT up to 3%, additional 3% on that. And the bigger question is who's going to collect that, because it was a little bit of it's the responsibility of the counties, right? So do they set up the whole taxation systems? And that's something that's there's a huge amount of uncertainty around this bill and around this procedure. But just from the, like when we talked about green fees, what they brought up first is like, probably operationally, the TAT would have been the easiest, right? But it's super difficult now, and nobody really knows what's going on with the TAT in general. And so that's kind of where we are. I mean, there's even doubt that this legislation will remain intact. So that just takes something off the table. And just to remind you, if they add it, normally the counties will add as much TAT as they can, right? Which is 3%. So that's 13.25% plus, nearly every single county now has a county surcharge. So that's 4.5%. So now we're getting to 13.75 plus 13.5. we're going to 17, 18% of room fees, right? Which is starting to get expensive in terms of your vacation. So these are all different things, but I just wanted to give you some background on that. And this is something for you guys, Conservation International guys. So if you had your druthers and they're like, what's your first best mechanism for doing this? Like, say politics is an issue. What would you guys do? Like, I decide to do it. And then the second is, I think Eric kind of mentioned this, but like, what are you guys going to push? Like, are you guys just asking for people to come up with good ideas, or are you guys actually spearheading a mechanism for doing something?
Man, if I could wave my wand and politics wasn't an issue, wow, Seth, it's a great world to live in. But I think, realistically, if we could get a couple points of the TAT into a special fund that has public-private management, and then gets added with private and public sources, and then we could get a bond issued to spend against it now because climate change and environmental degradation is a problem now, that's probably the best outcome. For me, that's just my opinion. Eric probably has more sophisticated thoughts, but I sort of think that realistically, we have to pick something that's easy now that builds the foundation that we can build on. We're not going to overnight, sort of solve this, but we can create something that is directionally accurate and has impact, including benefits, direct business benefits to the visitor sector. It will endure, right? So I can easily see spending that money on ecosystems that are far from the eyes of visitors, but critical to our water security and to our other, kind of key ecosystem benefits, but also investing in places that are highly visible, highly trafficked, and where the visitor sector will see, oh, I see the money going to work, and that's that's improving the visitor experience, and so I'm going to support this because it's now enhancing, because they're seeing declines in their customer satisfaction surveys based on crowding, poor facilities, degradation, and that's a long-term trend that if we don't reverse, people can go to Mexico, they can go to New Zealand, they can go to a lot of places. We get a lot of repeat visitors, and as that quality of experience declines, so too does their business models. So we have shared interest there, but that's where I think the most feasible pathway is, notwithstanding what you said earlier about how dynamic the TAT discussion is.
Jack and I differ. Thanks. I'll just take a minute. Jack and I differ a little bit on this, and I think it's a good thing. I absolutely agree with him that we got to get points on the board somehow. I'm with you, Seth. I'm worried a little bit about, my bags are packed, by the way, to move to the world without politics. Sounds wonderful. But if we were to go to back to the TAT, we have an issue with hospitality partners, and we have an issue we definitely have elasticity issues at 17-18%, per room per night. I do like the idea of some network, probably by island or county, of park systems. I think it gets around this issue of, hey, if I'm coming back from California to take care of my sick auntie, I got to pay this fee. So I think this idea of going to having it be place-based and paying, for a parking reservation or some such, really helps, because you have to opt into that, and there isn't this kind of inherent assumption that folks who are staying in that hotel room are going to go to these places that need care. So I would love to see a facilitated network of these places that go into a very small set of special funds that are very transparent and don't have spending ceilings. I don't know if this would ever fly, but if the county parks revenue into those special funds were what encumbered the state special funds that went in, then maybe that's a way to keep everybody kind of honest and transparent. One other way potentially to do it is the legislature did pass, which was pretty landmark, a non-resident, non-commercial marine fishing license for the state to institute. And if you look at that model for, beyond fishing is just kind of like an environmental license or then there's a fee around folks who want to go out and enjoy Hawaii's natural beauty. And there's already, case law that defends a higher price point for visitors versus residents. For residents, it could be free or it could be extremely nominal. For visitors, it could be quite expensive. I don't know about you guys, but when I went to the Salmon Islands to salmon fish and Dungeness crab, it was like $15 a day for 3 days, and I gladly paid it. So, that could be another way to approach this. But I think the legislative piece for this upcoming session is going to be establishing some kind of effective measures to protect special funds, target special funds, and also release them of these spending ceilings that can cause real headaches if, Diamond Head Park is bringing in lots of revenue right now, but the spending ceiling is at zero. So DLNR can't do anything with it. As an example of kind of how it's kind of, rock in a hard place. Thank you.
So as you know, the Commission is going to be sending a report to the legislature about our recommendations on changes to the tax system. And so if we were to include something on green fees, it would be useful to get something from you with one or more scenarios that you believe would work best so that we can consider them and look at the implications and decide whether we want to include them. Are you able to do that sometime in the next month or so?
Sure. Depends on what the scenario is. Do you guys have a template for this, or is this sort of more open and free form?
Oh, we make it up as we go.
All right. Well, if you've got like a good example that we could follow, we would gladly be constrained by previous approaches, because we have modeled out different scenarios and presented that at a very high level today. We also don't know if there's like do you guys have analytical capacity to sort of look at some of the numbers and make sure we're not off base there?
Seth, is your office able to provide the analysis?
Sure.
Okay. We can probably provide some sort of parameters for you so that it's not just wide open about what it is that we'd like to see from you.
Great. We would love, obviously, we'd be thrilled to be in the report. Maybe we can try to keep the scenarios to 2, maybe 3 different discrete approaches so that there's, we're not proposing a dozen different ways to do this.
Yeah, given the tug of war over the TAT, which has been well discussed, I would have at a minimum 1 TAT and 1 non-TAT option for funding, because if it's all TAT and the tug of war gets nasty, you're done.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that wouldn't, Beth, when were the deadline for that? When would you said a month, is there a specific date, or do you want to get back to me on
that? Can you get us something by the end of September?
Sure.
Seth, do you think that timing is appropriate, or do we need it sooner than that so that analysis can be done on it? I guess the sooner the better.
Yeah, analysis with TAT is like really straightforward for us.
Okay.
If you asked us to do where it would get tricky for it, to be perfectly frank, in terms of revenue from usage fees for parks, for like disaggregated things, we do not have that information. So we would not be the best people to provide that analysis. Probably you guys would, right? Because presumably you have more information than we do. But in terms of like TAT, that's really easy for us. And just to give you some quick feedback, the 150 would be with 2% increase. It's only be 65 million with 1.
So that was 2%. And you used visitor numbers from UHERO or something? I'm sure those are probably...
Yeah, I forget what, but like basically what I just did in my head is that good years, we collect about $650 million from the TAT, and that's close to more or less close to 10%. So if 1% of that was 65.
That's great. Thanks, Eric. Again, bounce. Great. Well, we'll be happy to put that together, and for the non-TAT sort of disaggregated thing, Seth, I think we can take it pretty far down the path, and maybe you could just sort of look at this and see this, say, this does sort of smell right, or it's just you're off track here or something. You can just be like give us friendly fire, and that way it's directionally accurate.
Happy to do that.
Well, thank you. Carissa, we haven't heard anything from you. Are you just, being the full-time support person?
Well, thank you for allowing me to introduce myself. My name is Carissa Cabrera. I'm managing the external communications to help communicate all of this nuance to our local residents, because while there's a lot of conversations that are happening in meetings like this, we've learned from the Palau Pristine Environmental Fee that transparency is really key with the community. And so I'm spearheading our social media campaigns to help educate the community about what a green fee is, what it could look like, what challenges we're facing with the mechanism, and then hopefully rally support and advocates as the legislative session approaches.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I want to thank you both for joining us today and providing such good food for thought.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and we'll be in touch. And please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Carissa if we can provide more information on any of this. We're happy to.
Yeah, thank you for your time. And if anything pops in your head, send us an email.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so now moving on, the next item on our agenda is discussion on compliance and enforcement. So I hope that all of you had an opportunity to read the report that SAIL sent to us. SAIL, would you like to highlight some of the information that you have in here?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't exactly know what I should be doing today or what the format should be. So it's kind of more like an outline, but there's a lot more information. I put a lot of it from the DO-TAX annual report. So a lot of the data came from there. It's not rocket science, any of this stuff. Basically, the kind of premise is that regardless of what the taxes that we're talking about, I know it's a kind of good segue to that earlier conversation that we just had. There's a lot of discussion on different sources of taxes, but if there are any that are statewide, they are going through the DO-TAX department, which had some challenges, and that's kind of what the whole topic was about. Currently, the vast majority of state tax revenue supporting general fund is going through the DO-TAX department, and they have challenges as far as staffing, and also they are subject to the same kind of across the board budget cuts, which to me actually don't make a whole lot of sense, because DO-TAX is the sole engine, well, one of these primary engines to generate revenue for the state. So, if you think about it like an engine or a car, right? You're cutting your car engine off where you need it the most, because you're reducing resources to the same level as everything else. Because DO-TAX is the only guys that are actually bringing in revenue. Well, one of the bigger sources of guys bringing in revenue. And to the extent that, the earlier conversations we had about different sources of taxes, if they're new or if they're additional, like the kind of nuance with the TAT county surcharge, if it gets administered through the tax department, which would be the easiest to do, I would think, it does require resources, right? So any of these new sources of funds that we're talking about, whether they be green taxes or anything else, they're subject to collection, and they're also subject to challenge by taxpayers. So to the extent that the Department of Taxation has the resources as far as technical people, systems people, they have to meet the challenge of being able to collect additional resources and also being able to defend what they get collected against taxpayers' efforts to defend themselves. Because, you know, it is a fairness kind of argument that the resources assigned to collect taxes should be trying to collect as fairly and as equitably as possible, right? So to the extent that they don't have the resources to go beyond voluntary compliance, it creates inequity, because you have people that are trying to comply with the law. They are voluntarily paying taxes, but you have a weak enforcement mechanism that creates a situation where there's a subset of people that don't want to comply with the law. So that's an inequitable situation that creates this shortfall in tax revenue for legislation that's already on the books. And that's kind of the general premise of what I'm kind of putting forth in my recommendation, is that it's not only a revenue generation exercise, it also is a fairness and equitable exercise. And to the future, there are developing areas of revenue in the state. For instance, the vacation rentals or Turo, peer-to-peer car rentals that the state has to keep up with. And the farther they get back in revenue sources to be able to support that in terms of hiring or in terms of technology, the harder it's going to be. It's a global problem as far as HR resources. It's extremely bad after COVID, and it's getting progressively worse. So to the extent that the state has to compete globally for resources and talent, in particular on the IT space, it has to be an area of focus. It can't just be left to just general kind of hiring practices, because they're going to fall farther behind. So that's kind of the premise. Happy to discuss whether the form of what the recommendation should be. I'm happy to draft it if that's where we want to go, or any other details or questions or any other comments.
Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to thank you for putting this together, because I thought it was a really clear and an interesting read. Before I ask any other questions, does anybody else have a comment or question for Sale?
I have something.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Murray.
Okay, just real quick. So I appreciated it too. I like the report as well, or the summary outline, whatever you're calling it. I do think it's important to just point out that it's like you said, that if we carry this in our report, and I think we probably should, just point out that it's counterproductive to cut off what feeds you when the budget's having a hard time. So let's cut off what feeds us when we're having a hard time. It doesn't make any sense. I think the problem behind that is probably twofold. One is that we have this misguided notion that fairness equals everyone gets the same treatment. So cut all departments the same.
Right.
When you make cuts, and equal is not fair, because you hurt, as you said yourself, it hurts everybody. The other thing I would say is to have credibility on the numbers, because I do like having those numbers you had in there. You know, every compliance enforcement officer maybe generates this much more money or whatever. There is obviously a law of diminishing returns, and the legislature doesn't know where that is. So does that number hold true for 10 more people, for 100, for 1,000? Certainly not for 1,000, right? So how much does that number hold true where you have this really diminishing returns by adding more budget or more staff? And if there's any way that we can, I know that's kind of an economic modeling thing. We don't have the time probably to do an economic model unless Seth already has something. But if we can give him an idea of what that kind of diminishing returns point is, that would give us more credibility than just saying every additional person gives us this much more revenue, where it's not quite that simple, right?
Sure. Yeah. A lot of that was based on a kind of email string with Director Choi. So they are working on a kind of staff model. So not really sure. I got to go follow up with him on when that's going to be done. But I think that would inform some of your question, that, you know, up to this point, this is what we need to collect an adequate amount of resources to collect, you know, the taxes that we're charged with currently.
And one last quick point before
Sure.
Winston or Beth takes over. I love the other argument on the fairness side of this is kind of what you were saying. When you cut enforcement, you basically make it easier for people to cheat. When you cut enforcement, essentially you're giving a tax cut to those most willing to cheat on their taxes.
Sure.
I mean,
yeah. I mean, enforcement is a bad word, but it is key to being fair. And as a individual and a corporate taxpayer, like we're not asking for any, we're not trying to cheat the system. But the fairness part is goes hand in hand with being part of the system, right? You want to ensure that everybody is being adequately and fairly treated and equitably treated, right? So that's the premise of it. That if you can't enforce the laws on your book fairly, then it's an unfair system.
Yep, agreed.
Murray, I just wanted to make one quick point to your point. Talking about diminishing returns, the diminishing returns only holds in a given organizational structure, right? So I would argue that depending on the type of people we get in the tax department, we could actually, it's not a linear function of the more people you add, because if you increased like the data analytic capabilities and did all those things, then an additional person might actually bring in way more, right?
Yep.
So I think it's a useful framework to think about this in terms of diminishing returns, but that almost always applies assuming that we're not going to change our business practices. And one of the opportunities that the Department of Taxation has is to adopt more modern ways of audit selection and doing things like that. And that is bigger than hiring 3 more auditors. That is about reorganizing the department.
Yeah, I think that's a qualitative statement that I tried to work into it too. That the workforce is changing and there's a whole lot of leverage going on, right? So in order to keep up with technology and the different business models that are progressing throughout the economy, the skill set of the people that you're hiring have to keep up. I mean, it's an arms race basically, right? You're trying. People are constantly innovating in the economy and you need to keep up with that. And if you don't, then there's just more leakage in the economy, right? So when we went to internet shopping, right, you can't be having auditors go out and check cash register receipts because they're not there, right? So you need data scientists and you need technologists to be able to kind of source and get their hands around where all the money is going in order to make the GET currently on the books enforceable to those parties. Right, so it is constantly evolving, and the resources, both human and technological capital resources, have to keep up. So yeah, to that question about it's not $3 million additional for every head. Every head's not equal. It's just a really gross and rough calculation. It's more to the point of what level of investment has to be funding DO tax to keep up with that resource constraints.
Winston.
Sale, thanks for this report. I was looking at that 17% vacancy rate, and you indicated that most of these openings are in staff IT finance positions. So this would include auditors, people with, I guess, college degrees, master's degrees. What type of candidates is the department really looking for, and what type of people specifically can you say that Director Choi is, trying to fill right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes hand in hand with, some of the technologists they have implemented a new platform, right? So with technology advancing as it is, you're competing against the same kind of companies, frankly, like we are. Like, Hawaiian has the same needs, right? As we have the same needs as Oracle, Google, and the Department of Taxation, because as technology gets better, the technology platforms get more common, right? So what the kind of pool of people you're trying to pick from are all the same people. And I think when COVID went in, you're competing not only based on location and skills, it's a global competition now, because people can work wherever they want to work. And that has been proven over the last 18 months. So to the extent that what are we looking for, or the Department of Taxation is looking for, it's looking for guys that are in very high demand right now throughout the economy. So you're looking at finance people, you're looking at IT people with skills in certain data sets. The technology that is being implemented now is the same as, basically a lot of the larger corporations. So that skill set is very much in demand, and people are willing to pay for it across the board right now.
And I'll just share one more aspect, like organizational difficulty here is senior people tend to have been in the state for a long time, right? And so it's really hard to get if the senior people aren't on board because they don't understand the technology, it's really hard to hire young people because they'll just get frustrated and things aren't going to really change, right? So we face it all the time that I do, that if you do innovative things, you need to work with other innovative people. But the way we hire people in the state is you get hired for really cheap and you stay in the state for a long time. And that's the financial incentive structure. And that's very difficult. That's an issue that the state all over, but particularly the Department of Taxation is going to have to reconcile with if they want to keep up with these things in the next 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's the direct opposite of the current market right now, because of the kind of transferability and transferability of skills. I mean, you're lucky probably to get 2 or 3 years out of technologists.
Yeah.
I mean, and the kind of gig economy that's working now, I mean, people will work whenever for however long they want to work. And when they're not completely satisfied with their current conditions, they'll find another job. And those are available in the current economy. So,
and we certainly do not provide flexibility here.
Yeah. If I can just add, first of all, Sil, thank you very much for putting that report together. From the, I guess, the professional side, and I'm kind of reinforcing what was already said, but the profession has morphed from here to here, and I think what we're all saying is the same thing, that DOTAX has to do the same. I mean, in the accounting profession, we went to risk-based auditing to minimize our time. Now with AI, we can do 100% testing just with technology, and I think that's a good example of what we're talking about. And I sit on a board for a fairly large private company, and we have like 80 people in IT, and half of them don't live in Hawaii. The talent is all elsewhere, whether it's Philippines, on the mainland. So, I think, and I know that was suggested, but I think that's an option that perhaps DOTAX has to take just to get the right kind of talent. I don't know how the legislature would feel about hiring people who are not residents here, but, you got to make that choice. Thank you.
Yeah, Alton. I think that's the kind of message, is that current model that DOTAX as a part of the state government has on a lot of issues, HR issues, outsourcing issues, just promotions and workplace environment in general, they seriously have to be looked at. I mean, on the DOTAX in particular, in order to keep people that you need to keep the revenues coming in, there has to be a response to that, because you're going to end up in a situation where you're just attriting people and you can't replace them.
Is there a plan for a study, or is there a proposal for a study? Is there anything going on right now that would point in the direction of some of the ways that DOTAX needs to modernize?
Yeah, I mean, I think other than that staffing plan, they have taken steps technology-wise to modernize. It's just the immediate threat right now, and the one they need to go deal with is a dedicated funding source. I mean, they were subject to the same across-the-board cuts, and I think what I'm kind of recommending is that that's kind of productive, like Murray says, that your source of resources you're cutting along with consumers of resources, which kind of doesn't make sense.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I also suspect that the salary levels that are available for the kinds of people who need to be recruited are not competitive.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's a kind of broader thing too. I mean, they play in the same space as all other state workers subject to the same contract, but I mean, I'm sure it's going around across the board, but there are certain skills that you're not even going to be close with the kind of salary offers that are being offered at the state level from the private sector. I mean, there's disparity within the private sector that it's pretty tremendous right now going on. So, I mean, competing public versus private, it must be even, more wide, the gap between the comp level. But I mean, then again, it's not all about comp either. It is about different things different people value, right? It's that value proposition that individuals have. So I think there's work to be done there for state HR folks, but it is something that needs to be addressed.
I'll have to apologize. I got distracted for a second. Is there presently a reason, or is there a law or whatever that you have to live in Hawaii to work for DoTax? Is it possible to be a remote worker for DoTax?
There's a law that says you have to be a state worker. If you're a state employed by the state government, you have to live in the state of Hawaii.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a law, but I do remember signing a contract when I did that. So there might not be a law, but there's definitely a policy.
Probably something to be rethought, especially with all we're learning about remote working from COVID, is you can get someone that's paying cost of living in, I'm going to make it up, Kentucky or Kansas, that has all the skills you need, and they can do it remotely because it's just finance and accounting or that type of thing, or IT, and they can do it all remotely. It'd save a boatload of money getting the right people. But
yeah, absolutely.
So Sale, do you have specific recommendations that you'd like for us to advance in our report?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is the dedicated funding source for DoTax.
Okay.
Or, some mechanism where their funding isn't subject to all the other cuts, because they are different. They're a different department than other departments in the state. I mean, I know like all state agencies have some ability to generate funds, but we're talking, 95% of the general fund, right? So if you don't have that department staffed and able to do that function, you can't fund the general fund. I mean, it's going to break down. You're going to have leakage. The more leakage you have, the more people that are non-compliant and you don't go after them, the worse it gets.
Yeah, when there are budget cuts, it's
they should be
that are funded by the general fund. They
get
the biggest cuts.
That's the biggest kind of recommendation I would have, is like there has to be a different consideration for DoTax.
Yeah. Okay.
So I guess that was a question too. Like, what should we do with? Well, how is this going to get packaged up? Because I mean, I could write pages on this stuff because there's pages of stuff out there, or I could write just what I just said. It could be a paragraph. So I don't know, like, how do we get some kind of idea of what the final product would be? I mean, I'm happy to just hang out for a while and wait till that, however everything else shapes up, and that can inform like how much content is in there. Because I think there is a great deal of kind of difference in volume that could be had with this topic. There is a clear takeaway, but there is all kinds of other supporting data too.
Any thoughts on that, folks?
I think as probably everyone on this call has read a lot of reports over the years, not just tax, but everything, all subjects, right? I think there's a trade-off between the length and the how long people stay engaged to read the entire thing. So I would think looking at the other tax review commission reports, it seems like a subject normally would last a couple pages or something like that. If you go much beyond a couple pages, people zone out. So, I mean, there's no magic number, but in my mind, if you can make your point in a couple pages, I think that's great. If it takes 5 or 10, it's more likely people are going to zone out on the whole thing. But, and my other thing is, the way you get the most out of those pages is at least for guys like me that appreciates data, whenever you have those numbers and statistics and things in there, just footnote all the, the backing for that kind of stuff. So you don't have to spend text space saying where you got all this information from. But that's my quick, very non-sophisticated way of estimating. I'd say a couple pages would
sure. Be fine. That's what I would think too.
Yeah, I think brevity is to be valued in this process. But I also think that if there is substantive information that would be important to provide to a reader who's really interested in this, it can also go into an appendix.
Okay.
So Sale, you can continue working on this and share updates with us as you complete them?
Yep.
Great. I'm so glad that you're doing this. This is obviously a really important issue.
Thank you. It is. I think it's pretty important, and it's the mechanics of things that often get overlooked.
Yeah. So one real quick, real question. On the new challenges that you cited in your outline, I was wondering if the department had any plans or any idea about implementing some sort of industry guide throughout. I mean, type of guidance, because I know the IRS has done that. And I know other states have done that, especially with the gig economy and these new types of markets that are showing up. A lot of times we have these states that are trying to play catch up and trying to, rein in the net on these new industries. But, considering that voluntary compliance constitutes more than 95% of collections, I think, it might be worthwhile to, look at the implications of getting ahead of these industries, and having the department issue guidance from the get-go. Yeah. Because just in discussions with people entering to these industries, a lot of times they're not sophisticated in accounting terms. That's why they're in a new industry, right? And they tell me, oh, so do I have to pay tax on this? And do I have to do this? And they're relatively simple answers that I think the department, I think it'd be a small investment for them to look at, but just issuing this guidance and saying, yes, it's there. This is a new market and we're developing our law on this, but I think, that might be a small thing, and I don't think it would require the most technologically savvy or IT literate people, but just speaking to, business people in the area, this is one of the suggestions that I've thought I'd bring up since you had compliance and all of that on your outline.
Okay, great point. Yeah. I mean, I think in general, most people want to follow the law. It's just difficult sometimes. I mean, particularly with state, interacting with the DO tax sometimes is not the easiest thing, or getting guidance out of them is not the easiest thing. And in these new areas that are developing, I think that's a great suggestion that they should put out some FAQs or like the IRS does on certain topics that would help people comply, because that's what you want to get people to do, is voluntarily comply. So yeah, great suggestion. I'll have a conversation with Director Troy on something like that for to carry out on that suggestion.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
If I can add to that, I mean, that's a great idea, Winston. And we do a lot of work with the international clients, and they understand the income tax part. But when they get to Hawaii General Excise Tax, all of a sudden it's, what the hell is this?
Exactly, right.
So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, GET compliance is it's kind of tricky.
Okay, anything else? Thank you, Sale, and thank you for continuing to contribute to this topic. The next item on our agenda is a discussion on hiring a consultant. And I hope that you all had a chance to look at the draft scope of work for BIBERS to provide some of this work. Basically, this scope identifies the priorities that we have that we want to look at. We would want him to review the previous work that was done for the most recent tax review commissions and bring us up to date on where those were as they address the priorities that we have. Then also provide a brief summary of the work that we have done from last November up to date. Then probably most importantly, summarize the analysis that we are inviting for our current priorities, and then drafting our final report. Any questions on that? Any suggestions for additional work that needs to be done? Murray?
Yeah, just in my review of it, and I thought it was well done, Beth. To me, there's 4 parts, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 that you had in your paper. I think 1 and 4 are by far the most important. Looking at the past reports, getting the best bits out of those, and then putting together the report for us. I can't remember if it was number 2 or number 3, but one of them sounded like kind of fleshing out the past minutes more, like recording all the past discussions that we've had, which might be not as good a use of time as, you know, just gathering the information from the past reports and then taking kind of the decisions we've made to build towards the final report. Maybe you didn't meet them as 4 equal, but I think 1 and 4 are the big ones for me.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that we would not want to spend a lot of time summarizing stuff that's already online. But, you know, maybe just to put a paragraph into our report about the things that we did this year. And to the extent that we need to review that information for the things that go into the final report. But you're absolutely right that I think that those are the areas that are of greatest importance. One question that we probably ought to address here is how much money we are currently estimating this is going to cost. And Baibars, were you able to get a more firm number? I have overtime hours up to a maximum of whatever, but maybe we should be a little more specific, not up to a maximum, but some certain.
In terms of feasibility, I think the human resources said it can be handled by overtime, the money I had suggested. But as Murray is making a good point, there's a bit of room for more work. And I was envisioning for number 3, I could offer more in-depth analysis for things like the standard deductions, the GT exemptions, tax credits, things like taxing the pension and retirement income, put it in context, maybe as in comparison to the federal, and kind of also pulling from the research that the TRP would be providing, and then incorporating that and put, also making presentations as we go. I know we have a tight time frame. So that was one thing I imagined I could be contributing. And that would be going as like appendix papers. So it can be either one large paper like the previous big consulting report that was relatively long, or it can be standalone little papers, reports that deal with some of these issues that I can provide more in-depth work. So that was what I was envisioning for item 3. And you're right, item 2 seems more kind of keeping track, like maybe supporting organizationally, but there's not much there. I'm not sure if that would be something that would be of interest to the commission.
You mean what you were just describing for item 3?
Right.
I think that it's important because those will help inform our discussion and will contribute the material that goes into the final report. So not to overlook that or underestimate how important that is.
Yeah, like I think I was saying before, I do like the style where the main report is almost like an executive summary of a big stack of appendices, that someone can understand exactly what we're recommending just by reading the main report. And only those that are technically interested enough have to kind of delve into the appendices. And if number 3 is basically fleshing out those appendices, then yeah, that makes sense to me as well.
So, Baibars, how much money are we? Because I would like to get everybody to decide whether we're going to approve this or not. So I think it's important for us to have the figure here.
I think it was something about, I think the budget I had suggested was 40,000 overall, and it had a breakdown, which is more for items 4 and 3, and slight much less for 2 and maybe somewhere in between for 1, for a total of 40,000 was what I had suggested. But again, what I'm envisioning is relatively more work on item 3, and there might be things that are coming up that you might ask me to look more in detail into when it comes to item 3. That would be the appendix and providing brief presentations in the coming meetings.
Okay, so are you thinking that maybe for today, 40,000 is a good figure, or should we maybe add 10% to that?
Excuse me, I didn't understand. 10%?
Well, but like...
No, I think I was... no, that fee wouldn't change. I okay. think I was envisioning something broader than maybe what is in the scope here. I mean, it doesn't exactly specify what it could be, but what I'm envisioning is something larger, okay. Like a bigger appendix and then presentations, preparation of the presentations.
Right, and I just want to point out that since we don't have a lot of experience in what the work might entail and how long it's going to take, we did include in here an opportunity to amend this agreement if necessary, if it is clear that we need more hours, more time, and BIBARS is willing to do it, we can change the agreement in the near future.
But to be clear, are we talking about, I guess what I'm not clear on, I understand the 40,000 estimate, but are we talking about kind of a fixed rate contract? Or are we talking about an hourly rate with a not to exceed amount, which are slightly different things, right?
The suggestion was a fixed amount. So I could be, if it were by the hours, I mean, I can easily see myself potentially spending more hours than what it might indicate on a per hourly basis if you just divide it by the number of hours to a I don't know, say 200 an hour or whatever a consulting time would be. So rather than keeping it that way, I thought for a big project like this, a fixed amount would be more useful.
Well, that's okay with you. It's, I mean, just speaking only for myself, that's certainly okay with me. I think I was getting sensitive to what Beth was saying. It sounded like what you were envisioning was a little bit bigger than what the scope of work directly describes. And I think, at least just again, speaking only for myself, what you described sounded pretty good to me. And I wanted to make sure you didn't price it at 40K and you actually think you're going to be doing this. You know, I want to make sure that we're fair as well.
Sure, I think, I mean, that's what I took into account. So by quoting that price, I think.
So it appears that what we've described here can be accomplished for $40,000. However, unknown variables that we may learn about in the near future would allow us to amend it. Are there any other questions about the details here? If not, I would like to ask for a motion to approve that we proceed with this scope of work and agreement to consult with Dr. Karakavali.
We need the help, so moved.
Okay, any second?
Second.
Okay, thank you, Alton. All in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carried. Okay, thank you very much. And BIBARS have lots of work to do, including next week, or next meeting rather. Our next meeting is going to be September 15th. And on that day, we are going to ask for a review of past reports and pertinent materials from past commissions that relate to our priorities. In addition, Winston, I've got you down for talking about tax credits and exemptions, and I'm going to talk about property taxes. So we've got a lot to cover. We have agreed that we're going to meet also on September 22nd, and Alton is going to talk about the Simpson-Bowles Commission idea. And we also are going to ask, I guess, Seth to talk about taxing pensions or taxing retirement income.
Sure.
Okay, any other business today?
Sorry, just to be clear, the next two meetings are September 15 and 22, is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hearing no other business, it is 1:31 and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.